looking at 4 generations in the United States of the Lowe family. That's 4 out of a total of 7 who have been here in this country since 1852. And our youngest one is our pride and joy. He's our great-grandson, Enzo Baeta. And his mom, our granddaughter, Lauren Baeta. And our daughter, Nancy Lowe. And then so there's 4 generations sitting right here. And we're all happy Americans, more or less Chinese.
That's good. Thank
Well, my name is Albert Lowe. This is my wife, Rose Marie Lowe. And I guess we're here today to sort of talk about some of the highlights of our lives, which has a little perspective of being Americans of Chinese ancestry, which might be a little different than the average American. To start with, my family came to America about the 1850s, and I'm actually the 4th generation American of Chinese ancestry here. On the other hand, my wife Rose's ancestry started a little bit later. Her father and mother came from China, so she's a 2nd generation American here. But with my family, my great-grandparents were the ones who migrated here during the gold rush days, and also to work on the railroads. Those were the 2 industries that were heavily popular for Chinese laborers. And in essence, the Chinese at that time of history in the United States were very much akin to the slaves in the South. I often say, well, the Africans came over to take care of the Eastern United States, and the Chinese came over to take care of the Western United States. It was all hard manual labor. And ultimately, my great-grandparents had children. They had 12 children, one of whom was my grandmother. So my grandmother was our first native-born Chinese American in our family. She was born in Sonoma, California, and then on down to my father and then myself and on to our children. So that's the overall background. And it's interesting, as we've gone through our lives, that we've had a wonderful life here in America. It was called, in Chinese, Golden Mountain. And so the people who came over from China were looking for a way to make money, quite frankly, like almost every immigrant who comes here, I think, as a way to make their lives better. But they called it the Golden Mountain, which I think was really a proper description and a nicely described name. I was born in San Diego in 1926, some 85 years ago, and lived there for the first 5 years of my life. And that's where I learned how to speak Chinese, because my grandmother, although she was born in the United States, they didn't have public schools in those days, so she did not go to school. She lived among the Chinese population, so she only spoke Chinese. She was my nanny for about the first 5 years of my life. So all I learned to speak in those days was Chinese. I practically went to public school at age 5 without speaking much English. So that was, I think, kind of an interesting highlight. And somehow that language stayed with me over all these years. And so what little I speak of Chinese today still emanated from those years 1 to 5.
My parents were both came over from China, and neither of them were well educated. My mother particularly was just a little young girl who lived in a village, and for some reason, I don't know whether it was because she was brave or adventurous, but she was chosen to come to America. In those days, people would be chosen to come. I think it was because during the earthquake in San Francisco, a lot of records were destroyed. And so people, I guess, never died. They used the papers to come to America. And so that's how my mother came over.
Let me
All by herself.
interject a thought here, if I may, Rose.
Yes.
In 1882, they passed a law in the United States called the Chinese Exclusion Act. That Chinese Exclusion Act basically said no Chinese are allowed to come to the United States anymore unless you are a immediate family relative of somebody who's already here. So what Rose is talking about is being qualified to come as a relative of somebody who's already in the United States.
Yes. And so she came and became a member of a family that I think she may have known, but maybe she didn't. But she became a member of that family and grew up there until she married my dad. My dad, meanwhile, had come to America to work in a laundry in Mobile, Alabama, that was owned by his uncle. And so when he wanted to find a wife, a matchmaker gave him pictures of people. And he chose my mom's picture on the advice of an uncle we called Uncle Fonzie. And the Chinese had a great belief in facial features. It could determine your character. And they chose my mom because of the way she looked. And after she finally did get to Mobile, he said it was a good choice because she had calluses on her hands. Meant she knew how to work. So, and they worked in a laundry. And I remember the laundry a lot because that was a big part of our lives as growing up. We had 5 children in our family, and 2 older boys and 2 younger girls. And I can remember that the laundry was our playground. We had big laundry baskets, huge things, carry the laundry. And we would jump in there and that would be our toys, and we'd roll around in the laundry. And I remember that when we ate, we put newspapers on the table to eat. And the laundry was always a big part of our lives because we all worked in the laundry. All of us kids did. And as soon as we were able to do anything, we worked in the laundry. And unlike your family, my mother never went to school until she was an adult. And then it was just little private lessons here and there. But she learned from us kids coming home and doing homework. And I remember that my mother and I both learned to use the dictionary the same night. My big brother taught us how. And Mother later said that she learned a lot because she had to call out the spelling words for us kids as we did our homework. Now, we kids had a wonderful life, I thought, because all we did was to go to school and play. And we invented things to do. We had a 2-story house, and we climbed all over, up and down, inside, outside. And we had a big shed in the yard adjoining us. And we climbed up on the shed and just spent the day doing what we wanted to do until it was dinner time. It was a fantastic way to grow up. We lived in the city of Mobile, right downtown, just about 2 blocks from where the laundry was. So we could go to the laundry and come back home just anytime we wanted to. And my brothers, I thought, were just wonderful people. As a young girl, I wanted to be a boy because they had so much fun and could do so many things. And my big brother told me if I could kiss my elbow, I would turn into a boy. And I spent a lot of time trying to kiss my elbow, and I never was able to. It's impossible. But, oh, and later on, we moved down, we bought a home on Mobile Bay. And Mobile Bay is very interesting in that the water gets deep very gradually. And so you can play around there very safely and go out a long ways and it still be just knee deep, waist deep. So it was a very safe place to grow up. I remember the first day we were there, we had to learn about tides. And it was low tide, and there were wood and things out there. We went out and raked our beachfront because it was kind of messy. We didn't know that the next tide would bring it all back again, but we learned. But growing up on the bay was fantastic because we were able to swim and boat and fish and crab and feel very independent. And it was relatively safe because the water just got deeper and deeper very, very gradually. We had to almost go out about a quarter of a mile before we were deep enough to really swim and enjoy a place to play in.
In my father's career, he was working for the Bank of America, and they asked him to go down to Calexico, which is a border town with Baja California, to help open a branch in Calexico, which he did it would have been about 1930. My biggest recollections of Calexico, in addition to being a pleasant small border town, was when my father came home from work one day in 1932, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and as a child, all I could figure was, I wonder why Dad's home so early, because he usually got home 6, 7 o'clock, like most workers. And he said, the banks were closed by the president. Well, in history, that was when Franklin Roosevelt closed the banks so they wouldn't have a run on the banks, and it was sort of the early start of the Great Depression in the United States. So I never forgot that particular confrontation with my dad when he came home early, and he explained that to me. Other than that, the most memorable thing I remember about Calexico was about the time we left Calexico. That was in 1939. And my dad had risen to the rank of what they called assistant cashier at the Bank of America during those years. He became very friendly with many of the executives at the branch because they would come down to Mexico to go dove hunting. And he would be one of the hosts, and he got to meet some of the bigwigs, so to speak, that ordinarily he would never have met. Well, around 1938, he started asking the bigwigs when he would have a chance to become a branch manager somewhere, because he felt that he was well qualified and he was kind of the senior assistant cashier at that branch, and he had seen some of his colleagues being elevated to managerships, but he never was chosen. So after a few months, one of them took him aside and said, Al, he said, his name was Al too. So he said, Al, I want to tell you something kind of personal, but you're never going to be a manager because of your race. We don't see on the horizon ever having a Chinese person as the manager of a Bank of America. So the reality is you're stuck where you are. Well, my dad was always a positive thinker, and although he faced that level of discrimination, it was not unexpected. And he always looked at the discrimination factor as the glass half full rather than the glass half empty. So he said, well, what shall I do? He decided the only way to do that is to go into business for himself, because he felt he would face similar discrimination almost anywhere he worked. So he started searching around for locations where to move to, and he finally ended on Pasadena, California, I think for two basic reasons. First of all, Pasadena had a very good reputation as a good city. Secondly, it had a reputation for one of the finest educational cities in California for public education. And with 3 children, that made sense to him. So he decided he would open his little gift shop, Chinese curio gift shop in Pasadena. All he had to do was figure out how he was going to pay for it. Well, he borrowed $3,000 on his life insurance policy, and fortunately he had a good friend who was an importer from Chinese merchandise who's located in Los Angeles, who was willing to stake him to $20,000 worth of inventory. So with $3,000 in cash and $20,000 in inventory, he was able to open this little store in Pasadena on Colorado Boulevard. I still remember the first day we opened. I was 13 years old at that time. My sister was 2 years older, and we had the responsibility of helping open the store, which involved marking merchandise, and we were so annoying about things. We had to write down on our price tags what the product was so we would know that this was brass, or this was enamel, or this was cloisonne, or whatever. So I still remember doing that. And I remember that we opened on November 15th of 1939. My dad chose that date because a big department store was opening 3 doors away from us called the Broadway Department Store. And he said, I can't afford to advertise. I just want to open the store so when the people walk by, some of them might stop in. So believe it or not, I still remember how much business we did that day. It was $26. That was our first day of business.
I wanted to also talk about Al's mom. She was a fantastic person, very strong and very compassionate too. She was everybody's ombudsman. She could take care of anybody who had a problem with anything. She would see it through from beginning to end and make sure it didn't get waylaid along the way. Even at the store, at the furniture store where she was the highest person there, she would hire people who needed help. They may not be very good workers or anything, but they needed help. So she would bring them in and they would become part of the family. And she was the kind of person that if a family had a son, particularly a son who wasn't doing all the right things in the right way, they would send them to Annie to take care of and to straighten them up. And she did. And so we had a series of young men who came and...
Series of cousins.
Yeah, came and got trained in Annie's way of living. So that was very interesting to be acquainted and associated with a person so strong and so moving in so many people's lives. She was a wonderful, wonderful woman.
So Pasadena became our new home. The next point of interest that I found was, again, a sort of a discrimination factor. We found we couldn't live in we couldn't rent the house we wanted to rent because it was restricted and they wouldn't let the non-whites live there. So we went to another part of town where they allowed non-whites to live, and that was fine. I enrolled in school, and within about a year we moved closer to the districts where they didn't allow non-whites, but there was a house that they would allow us to rent. It was about 2 blocks from the Pasadena City College. So we lived there for many years. I went to school in Pasadena, graduated from John Muir High School. And all during that time, we were kids who went to school and then went to work, went to school, went to work. When I graduated from high school in 1943, that was about 2 years after World War II began, which started from the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. I was 17 years old, and I knew that I would be drafted in the Army if I went in when I was 18. So I decided I didn't want to go to the Army. I would rather enlist in the Navy or the Air Force. So having graduated, I went to Los Angeles with a few of my buddies, and we decided we were going to enlist in the U.S. Air Force. We passed the preliminary examination, a physical, and some very simple written examinations. And the three of my friends who were with me were all ready to get their instructions on when to report to duty. But they pulled me aside and said, Mr. Lowe, you're going to have to wait a little while. I said, why? He said, because you're Chinese, and we have to send your application to Washington. And it won't take too long, probably 4 or 5 months, and you'll be advised. Well, that was probably the second thing I really remembered much about being different. You know, we couldn't live where we wanted to live, and now I couldn't sign up when I wanted to sign up. So, but like my dad, I just accepted it, went home, disappointed, but it wasn't the end of the world. So I waited and waited, and 3 months went by, and there was no response from the government. So meanwhile, I heard about a program for the United States Merchant Marine Service Academy, where I could sign up. I decided not to wait for the Air Force. I signed up for the United States Merchant Marine Academy. And meanwhile, I went to USC for 1 semester. And then I left to go to basic training in San Mateo, which was the 3 months basic training for that Merchant Marine Academy. The next few years of my life, next 2 years of my life, were most interesting. Now I'm a teenager who knows it all, right? But I found out that I hadn't ever been out of Southern California. My first big visit was to San Francisco, that big old city, San Francisco. And then we went to San Mateo. Once I got on shipboard to do duty as a cadet midshipman of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, I got on board one of these big ships in the San Francisco harbor. And for the next year and a half, next half a year, I was going to see the world. It reminded me of the Navy saying that join the Navy to see the world. Well, I was looking forward to that. So sure enough, I got a chance to stop at Chile, stopped at Peru, went through the Panama Canal, stopped in Cuba, Havana, and ended up in up the East Coast, up in New York, and then on up to Boston. So for someone who never left California, that was a pretty exciting adventure. And then we came back through the Panama Canal, back up to San Francisco, changed ships, and the next trip was the more military type. We went all the way across the Pacific to Australia first, where we had loaded some cargo, and then we went to the islands north of Australia where the Army and the Marines were fighting the war. And that was more scary because you were closer to the battle. But again, it was an interesting experience. So that was quite an adventure for a young 18-year-old kid. And I learned to smoke then. That was a bad habit. So had to join it with a gang. You know, sailors always drink and smoke. I didn't drink much, but I smoked. So we got back and was discharged for the ship, and then went to the Merchant Marine Academy, which is located in Long Island, New York. Here I am now, 19 years old, going to the Merchant Marine Academy for a 9-month continuation of my education. That was another great adventure, because now I got to see the big city of New York City. And while I was there, I had the good fortune of meeting my wife's brother, who was in the Navy. He was stationed on board a ship in New Jersey, which is very close to New York City. And he was 2 years older than me, but I was 19, he was 21, and we were all both getting acquainted with the city. And every Saturday we would go into New York City and go to the, we call it the canteen. It was where they invited servicemen to come and visit, and they would have young girls who would volunteer to come and be friendly with the servicemen and things like that. It was a USO type of canteen. So we got really well acquainted over a period of about 3 months. Every week we would get together and we would date some of the girls and we would just sort of pal around together. So we got to know each other really well. And one of the interesting things about that from a romantic standpoint is I had the opportunity to meet my wife's parents and sister in New York City while my wife and her sister were going to school back in California in USC. So while she was in California at USC, she met my brother and my sister who were also students there, and they became buddy-buddies in California, while I was buddy-buddying with her brother in New York City and had met her family. Of course, all this time I had no idea that she even existed, and probably the same with her. So that was a major adventure, you know, in my life. Well, I sailed after graduation from the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. I went sailing again for a short time. On this particular trip, we ended up going to Shanghai, China, which was a big adventure for me to go back to my home country. And it was, the funniest part about that was my shipmates expected me to be able to interpret for them when they went to Shanghai, China, because they didn't speak Chinese, and most of the Chinese there didn't speak English. And I had to tell them that I was a real third-generation native-born American, and I don't speak Chinese. So they threw me overboard, not physically, mentally. And but we went on and we did our usual thing. We had a lot of fun in Shanghai, and I enjoyed it so much. I wrote home. I said, you know, this is pretty good. I'd like to sail for another year before I come home. In the Chinese family, it's pretty disciplined that whatever your parents say to do, you do. So I got a letter back from my mother that says, come home as soon as you can. We need you here. And that's because we had our little business. And my dad had been called away, not for military service, but for government service during World War II. So my mother was running our business, and she ran it very well. She's a good businesswoman, but she needed help. So bottom line is I left the Merchant Marine, went home, went back to USC, went back to work, and probably one of the most providential things about that is I got to meet Rose Marie in college. She was actually in her 5th year for USC in her major, and I had 2 years to finish mine. This was in 1946. Meanwhile, the war had ended, and we were back into a peacetime situation.
We came out to California. Well, actually, I went to college in a year in Alabama and a year in New Orleans. I went to Sophie Newcomb, which is a branch of Tulane, as the girls' portion of Tulane. And when I first went to college, people, my friends, would be rolling on the floor laughing at my Southern accent. So I had to try to learn to kind of modify that a little bit. And even now, people say that they can detect something's different. And I know when I come back from visiting Mobile, it's there again. Well, I wanted to say a little bit about my mom and my dad. My mom raised 5 kids, and it was very interesting, her way of disciplining us. We pretty much could do anything we wanted to do unless it just got on her nerves too much. Because we weren't bad kids, but we would be pretty rowdy sometimes. And it was interesting that she didn't care who did it. She'd just have to catch one of us. And so we'd all run around. You want to take care of that?
Yeah, I'll put it in my pocket.
Oh, okay. We would all run around trying to keep away from her. And she would catch one of us, and it didn't matter who she caught, but that was the one who got their ears pulled or whatever. And the rest of us would just sit around and laugh. So that was about the most harsh thing that could happen to us, would be Mom chasing after us because we were just a little bit too noisy or too rough. And my dad was interesting to me because he was very businesslike, even with dealing with us kids. If he wanted to talk to me about something, he would say, meet me at my office at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And I would spend the rest of the day wondering, what have I done? What's going to happen to me? And every time it happened, he would just say, I just want you to be a good girl now and just, do all the right thing. Okay, Dad. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Because we said, yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. That was the way we spoke to our parents. We had so much freedom. I just can't believe it. And yet, Mother knew enough to give us girls music lessons and dancing lessons, and I appreciated that so much. Not so much the music, because that seemed like work, but I really enjoyed the dancing. And I think I still rate that as one of the nicest things my mother did for me, was to give me dancing lessons, because it gave me a great appreciation of my body, how it works, and it gave me a body awareness of what was going on in the different parts of my body. And it made me conscious as I've gotten older that I need to take care of my body. And it's been fun trying to. I made the remark once to a physiologist. I says, I finally learned that if you can move, you can get better. She says, that's true. But she says, you know what? If you can breathe, you can get better. And I thought that was pretty profound, but I like that. Well, when we were growing up in Alabama, our family was the only Chinese family in the city. And we had cousins and friends from New Orleans who would come and visit us now and then. As we got older, well, in those days, we were expected to marry within our race. Not just Asian. Chinese marry Chinese. Well, there weren't many Chinese boys around for us girls. And so when I became a junior in college, my younger sister was also ready to go to college. And so my parents decided, particularly my dad, decided that we should go to college in California. Now, there were two of us, we could go together, and it was safe for us to go together. We could go to California and meet nice Chinese boys and perhaps marry them. And so that was the plan, and so that was what we did. We got catalogs, and can you imagine trying to choose a college to go do just from reading a catalog?
I thought you could say you got catalog of Chinese boys.
Yeah. The boys we met that were supposedly available to us in the South, we didn't think very much of. And so we were happy to go to California. But we chose Southern California for some reason. I don't know why. But we chose Southern California, and it turned out very fortunate, because if we hadn't chosen that school, I never would have met this fellow over here. That was one of the great things about going to college and choosing the right college. Oh, by the way, I should mention that I was very lucky to have a sister to go with me to California, because she is a very, very bright person. And I never had to use a dictionary. I just asked her, and she could tell me the definition of any word I could think of. So that was very nice. And Al was talking about meeting my brother in New York. Meanwhile, in California, going to SC, the Chinese kids kind of banded together in a club, and my sister and I got to know his sister and his younger brother, and we spent time with them in their family, in their home, on weekends and special holidays when it wouldn't be enough time to go back to Alabama, because in those days a train trip, no planes in those days, a train trip would take 3 days And so we would spend like Thanksgiving and other holidays and events at his house, not knowing that eventually that would become my ability to meet you, and that was very fortunate.
Fate.
I can't.
It's called fate.
Yeah, I can't imagine life any other way.
So I went to USC, graduated, and it was in 1948, early 1948, that I asked Rosemary to marry me, and she accepted. I still remember that this was in Pasadena, and I don't know why we did this, but we went out and called her parents from the phone booth at the thrifty department store on Lake in Colorado. We must have been out dating or something when we did this, and we decided to call right away. Anyhow, I called and talked to her mother, and she was all excited. She indicated that she would like the idea and so forth. And so we were very happy, of course, because basically I called to say I'd like to marry Rosemary, and she was very happy about that. I found out later that I was not required to go back to Mobile to get passed on by her father, because they had met me in New York, and that sufficed for them to use for a judgment as to whether they would allow me to marry their daughter. So that saved me a long trip to Alabama. One of the most interesting things I found when I went to Alabama for the wedding, 8 months later, because we were married on August 1st, 1948, was when we went to the county courthouse in Alabama, in Mobile, to get our marriage license. I'd never been to the South before, and the first thing I noticed was not a surprise, but I noticed that the drinking fountains had signs above them for blacks and for whites. So wherever you went in a public place where they had drinking fountains, they always had white and black fountains. But I was surprised at the courthouse when I went there. They have a master sign-up book about that thick at that time, and it was a long counter, about a 15-foot long counter, where the clerk was behind it, and you would talk to them. And they said, well, you sign up in that book over to the right, far right. So I said, okay. What's the book on the far left? I said, oh, that's for blacks. Well, in Alabama, you were either white or black. You weren't Asian, or you weren't anything else, or Hispanic. You were either white or you were black, and in Alabama, Chinese were classified as whites. So we went over this sign. There was no problem or anything. It was just a sudden consciousness that people are thought of in terms of their race. So it was an unusual situation. And so we were married in a wonderful ceremony in the Baptist Church, First Baptist Church in Mobile. And then we headed north for our next adventure, which was our honeymoon, which took place in Lake George, upper state New York. A beautiful, beautiful site for a honeymoon, and we had a great time there. In addition to the usual things you remember about honeymoons, the most interesting things I think we found there is that we first learned about pizza on our honeymoon. We met some Americans of Italian ancestry, and one night they said, let's go get some pizza. And I said, what's pizza? So today, that's as American as it can be, but in those days, I guess it wasn't, so at least it wasn't for us.
And they said, we said, where do you get pizzas? And they said, at a pizzeria.
Yeah, where else but a pizzeria?
Well, after a wonderful honeymoon in New York, we migrated back to California to get back to the real world, so to speak. And one of the first things we found had again to do with Chinese discrimination. My dad had bought a piece of residential property in Pasadena, a lot that he wanted to build a house on. And at the time he did it, he was thinking of a house for his family. He wasn't thinking about us as married people. But as soon as he bought the property, the neighbors, not all the neighbors, but many of the neighbors across the street and adjacent properties passed around a petition in the neighborhood that was signed by about 20 or so people. And they basically said, Mr. Lowe, when we bought our property here, we thought all of the property was restricted to to whites only. And we believe our property values will go down if you stay with your property and you build your house. We would like you to sell your property so we can get it restricted to whites only, like all the rest of our properties are, in the interest of preserving our property values. And we will be sure that you get back all the money you paid for the property. You won't lose any money. Well, my dad took that, and his immediate reaction was no. He bought the property, and he wants to live there. And he was a member of the Pasadena Rotary Club at that time, only a fairly new member, which, by the way, is a milestone of its own. He was the first non-white member of the Rotary Club of Pasadena. But the Rotarians liked him a lot. He used to pal around with them, play cool bowling and all. So they were good friends. And so a couple of them who were pretty active in the community said, Al, don't do it. We'll stand behind you. There's no reason for them to do that. You stick to your guns. And so he basically handled it by ignoring it. He didn't do anything to fight it. He just didn't respond. And so they couldn't do anything about it because he bought a piece of property that was not restricted. Now, many people do not know that, at least in California, I don't know where else, it was common for residential properties to have covenants in it that said this property may be sold only to whites only. That was later stricken by the Supreme Court. I think it was in the 1940s that they decided that that was unconstitutional. And from that point on, those restrictive covenants were no longer. But at that time, it was very common. So we built the house, and it's nice to think that as the years have gone by, the neighbors got to know us as a family and as people, and we became friends and everything else, no problem. But that was kind of a disgusting thing to first come home to after I realized I wasn't in the military service, but I gave 2.5 years to the service in order to do what all Americans would willing to do, and then you come back and get Cold War. That was not so good. So by then, we were married, and my dad decided that he would build a house, but he would allow us to live there, and he would stay in the house that he lived in for many, many years. So it became our house, our first home, on Wilson Street in Pasadena. And that's where we started our family, and started the life that you do once you get married and start having children. As Rose has often said, your life really changes when you have children. And it doesn't mean it's changed for the worse, it just changes. And your whole orientation to things goes to that. We were blessed with 4 wonderful children. We had a great young life with them. I was working like a beaver all the time, because when you start a business of your own, it knows no end, no bounds. Anybody who's been in it for themselves knows that you take work home at night, and you do it at night, and you go back to work the next day, and so forth. So I did that for many, many years, and didn't think anything of it. That's what you do when you run your own business. Meanwhile, Rose did a marvelous job. I gave her all the credit for the parenting, because she was a stay-at-home mom, took very good care of the children, saw that they did everything that was expected of them, and as a result, I would say they have become wonderful, mature adults, self-reliant, and with good character, and doing everything that I would want anyone to do.
There was a time when I was not well, and I didn't have much energy, and wasn't able to really go through a whole day of doing what I usually do. And it was interesting that Al and the kids all stepped in to help take care of me. Like we would be driving and with a destination maybe to go to music lessons or dancing lesson or go to the store. And in those days, under those conditions, I couldn't think too clearly or concentrate too well. So I depended on the kids to make sure I would make the right turns and end up at the right place. And also during that time, I told Al, I says, I can do dinner, but I can't do breakfast and lunch. And so they all pitched in and took care of the breakfast and the lunches. And I really credit that episode of giving the kids a lot of independence, and because they had not only had to take care of themselves, but they had to take care of me. And since that time, they all just managed everything that needed to be done, their homework, applying for college, just managing their lives. And I think that's been one of the greatest, wonderful things that happened in our family. And an interesting thing that I came out of that episode of my life by exercise. It was a time when my two older girls were complaining that they weren't able to do a lot of the things that the other kids were able to do physically. I said, well, let's exercise. We'll get together and do exercise. So we had a program going on in those days. It was the Royal Canadian Air Force exercises that let us do a certain amount of things one week, and next week you would progress to another stage. And so we all got better. And that took me out of that stage of where I was. And that there again was the emphasis for me that exercise has been a great part of my life all the time.
My life was pretty well wrapped around the business and the community. After my dad died unusually young at the age of 51 in 1952, they invited me to join the Rotary Club kind of in his place. I was only 26 years old at the time, which is rather young for a Rotarian, and most of the Rotarians were in their 50s. Nevertheless, I joined the Rotary Club, and that's what really triggered me into the whole concept of community service, because it is a service club. And I remember my first community service was with the YMCA, where I participated in the membership drive and ultimately became a member of the regional committees, and ultimately a member of the board of directors, and ultimately chairman of the drives, and all those kinds of things that you do when you get started in community service. And from there, I moved into the area of race relations and public education. Public education primarily, I think, because we had 4 children in school, so naturally I was caring about what happened to the schools. And we were always having a bond issue or a tax override election or something in which you did things to help the schools finance themselves. So I was engaged in many of those, just as a regular, ordinary volunteer and worker. And what you find is when you volunteer, I guess if you do at least a halfway decent job, you get invited to keep on volunteering, and it just keeps growing, growing, growing. And you never learn how to quite say no, so you just keep doing, doing, doing. One of the things I did during the early years was join Toastmasters, because I started to have to talk to people in groups and so forth, and I wasn't very good at it and get nervous all the time, so I joined Toastmasters, and it was a tremendous help to me. I guess I was active for about maybe 2.5 years or so, and by that time I was involved in other groups and other things, and I found that you lose your nervousness, and it's just like talking to anybody as an individual. So that was really a tremendous benefit for me. And as I kept doing more and more for the public schools, it became pretty clear that the question of racial segregation in our Pasadena public schools was starting to become a question and an issue. This was a bit ahead of the big problems of racial segregation recognized nationwide.
in Pasadena, we had schools that were almost all black and schools that were almost all white. And the friction in the community was growing over the years because the recognition by at least the black parents and community was that their schools were getting short shrift on numerous things. Conversely, the people in the white schools didn't think that was true at all. They said every school's so open, you all got principals, and everything is equal. Well, oftentimes how you look at things and how you're treated dictates whether things are good or bad. So there became this friction. And then it was, I believe it was 1952, when the U.S. Supreme Court declared that segregated schools were inherently unequal. They were primarily speaking of the South, because the challenge was made in the state of Kansas, which wasn't a southern state, but it was close to the South. And that ruling in 1952 changed the whole concept of racial enrollment in the public schools throughout the nation. Well, they started trying to correct that in the South first, because that's where we're so big and heavy. And all of us will remember when the schools were desegregated there, and they had the governor standing in the door of the schools and wouldn't let the kids in, and the U.S. government sent the Army down there to enforce the rules of non-segregation and so forth. But in the western states, people generally felt it was not a problem because they didn't have the masses that they have in the South. But certain communities did have. Pasadena was one of them. So as time went by, I was not involved in the issue early on, but you couldn't forget it because it would be in the newspapers and people would be complaining. And then the school district started setting up committees to study the issue and make recommendations to the Board of Education as to what it should do. And I got involved in all those kind of things. I think it was kind of natural because here I was neither white nor black, American through and through, but still had some sensitivity to the ethnic differences. So I was asked to a lot of committees to do that, and I was glad to serve on them. And you learn as you go along. You learn the problems more than anything else. But in addition to that, you find out that throughout the nation, there have been people studying the issue on a high-level scale, PhDs and professors and people in the high-level academic world getting statistics and doing studies as to what happens in the schools and so forth. So I spent my time when I was on these committees trying to learn about what's happening and trying to decide what is most fair and what is most beneficial towards quality education and things of that nature. So I did a lot of that from 1950 until I ran for the school board in 1969. Now, I became a Rotarian in 1952, and it was around 1960 that I started being more active in the school areas. The tax overrides and the integration issues started around 1960. I got on those committees. And by the time around 1965, 66 came along, I was pretty convinced in my mind that the Supreme Court was right, that segregated schools are inherently unequal just by the nature of the composition. And I also became convinced by the studies that when you have schools that had a blend of students of various races, it was largely due to a class situation, economic class. That if you had a blend of the economic classes going to school in the same school, everyone did better. The higher achievers did not come down, but the lower achievers came up. So rightly or wrongly, I believe that that was the basic conclusion that was correct. And so when the question came of whether Pasadena should desegregate its schools are concerned, I felt in my heart and my mind, and it was the right thing to do for all the students. Well, meanwhile, there were lawsuits against the school district that were directed towards requiring the Pasadena schools to desegregate their schools. And in early 1969, the ruling from the U.S. District Court in Los Angeles was that Pasadena did indeed consciously segregate their schools over the previous years. They told stories about school buses that went from white districts, taking the kids past the white schools over to areas where the dark schools were, probably the other way around. They would take the white children past the schools that were heavily black to a school farther away that was heavily white and enroll them in the white schools. So that it was part of the practice of the Pasadena school districts to do that, which was not unlike the average school district in the whole country. But anyway, the court decided that that was illegal based upon the Supreme Court ruling in 1952, and they ordered the Pasadena schools to desegregate. Well, as luck would have it, I ran for election on the school board in 1969, and just as the ruling came down, I was being seated on the school board. From a personal standpoint, there was no quarrel in my mind of what was the right thing to do. The difficult thing to do was, how do you do that in this community that was probably 75% against it? And that was another life's experience, because you go through where people, almost everybody loved you, thinking you were a good person, had a good business and all that, to where 75% of them decided to hate you. And but it isn't hard to do those things when you believe something is right. You hope that you're right, but if you believe it's right, you can take a whole lot. But I was worried because they threatened physical harm, and they threatened physical harm to your family and all that. But luckily, almost all of it was just words. And the school board decided it was the right thing to do. It was a 3-2 vote on the school board. And they decided it was the right thing to do. And as much as they hated to require it on the community that didn't really want it, they voted to do it. So we spent the next year developing a plan to try to do it in the most humane and positive way that we possibly could. And we put it through. I often said to Rose afterwards that after going through this segregation battle, everything else in life seems real simple. So when I ran into other kinds of problems in business and otherwise, no problem. That's what life does to you. When you hit the real rough spots, all the other spots seem pretty smooth. But that was quite an experience, and we did it. There was a recall election that attempted to recall me and the other two board members who voted for it. Everyone in the political arena was sure we would be recalled. But again, to say good things about Pasadena, the newspaper, the city council, many of the leaders of Pasadena said, even though they might have disagreed with our decision, they said, you should not recall these people just because they made a decision that you don't like. There's no malfeasance. They acted in what they thought was their best correct interest, and even though we disagree with the decision, we do not think they should be recalled. Nevertheless, they still predicted, and we thought, frankly, we would be wiped out. Turned out we won by about 1%, and a lot of the political prognosticators were so surprised. They were glad, but they were so surprised. They couldn't see how we were going to win the election. Anyway, that allowed us a chance to implement the Pasadena plan, which blended the schools throughout the district, and we worked our best. Unfortunately, learning in the years that ensued, you find when 75% of the people don't like what you do, you're not going to be very successful in doing it. And so over the years, gradually, whites stopped sending the kids to the Pasadena schools. They either put it in private schools or they moved away. And over the years, you would have the non-whites going to schools, but not the white people coming in. As a result, Pasadena resegregated, basically, which again is a history of practically every school district I know of in the whole country that desegregated the schools. They have become resegregated. So it's still a massive problem as far as the nation is concerned, and I wish I could say what you could do about it, but I can't. But that was a real strong life experience to go through. The good news about that is that there are many people who, the 25% who felt it was the right thing to do, really became your friends. You just got a huge number of friends that you never had before. So you have to look at it from that standpoint. And the other people, they're going to hate you no matter what, so you just do what you can do. So that was a major part of my life from the 1960s to the 1970s. My dad led us, I think, wisely on that. He always taught us to keep a positive attitude, that in spite of discrimination that you're apt to run into in your life, the opportunities are enormous. And if you just keep positively focused, you'll be okay. And he had two sayings that I think are very meaningful, and I always thought it was the right thing to say. He says, well, as a Chinese, you're going to have to work twice as hard and get half as far. But half as far is going to be pretty good. And the other thing he said was, don't ever complain about paying taxes, because that's what you pay for the privilege of living in a wonderful country like America. And his final admonition, which I still take to heart, is community service is what you owe the community for having a great place in which to live. So I think if all of us can live by those credos, we can't go very far wrong. So he didn't have a whole lot to say. He lived a short life. He died at the age of 51, but he had some, I think, pretty good wisdom there. And I would say that anyone could follow those ideas and come out ahead.
Al mentioned that life went on. You go to work every day, is all the same. But apparently it wasn't all the same. There were other things going on. And it affected us too, in a way. We pitched in ways that we could. Like in those days, that was when I wasn't feeling well. I could not go into controversial type things, but I could work. And so I would go down to the campaign offices, and I would teach everybody the most efficient way to lick envelopes. We didn't lick envelopes, but to seal envelopes, put the stamps on, address things, and we all learned to do those things with no lost motion. And things got done very quickly and very efficiently. So that was fun. And I credit my training in the laundry business for doing some of those things, of organizing things, because in the laundry business, you can imagine, you have hundreds of items coming in from different families, going to different parts of the laundry: shirts, blankets, sheets, tableware, and they all have to come out together and go to the right, be packaged up to go back to the right family. So I learned a lot of organization from working in the laundry, which I was able to use in your store. I helped to organize a lot of things in a lot of ways, which you could have done very well without, but it helped, I think.
Enormously.
So that was fun.
We continued in our family business, which was Lowe's furniture store, until 1986. 25 years ago. It's hard to imagine it was that long ago. We sold out the inventory and just closed the store. But it was certainly a way of life as far as my adult life is concerned. And I continued to do some more community service activities for a few years. And that was good too. Pasadena Playhouse was something that I spent a lot of time on in my post-business years. And it's good to see that they're still operating and doing okay. I don't think they'll ever do fantastic because those kinds of enterprises always are short of money, and they're always trying to find ways to increase their ticket sales in the box office. But it's a wonderful institution. I learned a lot by associating with the Pasadena Playhouse, which is the only official state theater of California, by the way, the Pasadena Playhouse. Moving to the Bay Area is the last chapter we had in change of our lives, and that's been a marvelous experience, particularly because all of our children and grandchildren are now living in the Bay Area. So we only have to drive an hour or so anywhere to get to see any of our children or our grandchildren, and that's terrific. But we've been blessed in many, many ways.
Can't imagine life any other way.
See the pyramids along the Nile. Watch the sunrise on a tropic isle. Just remember, darling, all the while you belong to me. See the marketplace in old Algiers. Send me photographs and souvenirs. Just remember, when a dream appears, you belong to me. I'll be so alone without you. Maybe you'll be lonesome too, and blue. Fly the ocean in a silver plane. See the jungle when it's wet with rain. Just remember, till you're home